Hello. Welcome to the curatorial series, brought to you by the Museum of the Great Southern, part of the West Australian Museum, and we're based in Albany, in Western Australia. My name is Malcolm Trail. I'm the Programs Officer at the Museum of the Great Southern, but I'm also a historian who specialises in Albany tales. And today I'm going to tell you a tale of quarantine. At the time of recording this, it's very topical. And I entitled this talk, Flying the Yellow Jack. Now that's a good place to start. What is the Yellow Jack? And what does it mean in maritime terms? Well, let's start with the colour yellow. That's a good place. Yellow can stand for happiness, energy, but also for jealousy. And it often symbolises the sunshine. In China, yellow is considered to be the imperial colour, and Buddhists consider it a colour representing humility. Yellow is also the colour of warning, the amber light. And maybe that's where we're coming from in this tale of quarantine. Because quarantine represents disease and warning. And the yellow jack, looking at this chart of maritime flags, you can see under the letter Q, there's a yellow flag there. Now, if you look closely, you can see that Q represents the fact that the vessel is healthy and requests free pratique, which is free passage, which doesn't really equate with the colour of quarantine, but it does have that letter Q. The word quarantine comes from the Italian 40 days, which was the period that sailors were required to self-isolate in Venice when they returned in the 12th, 13th and 14th centuries from voyages to the Far East. So that's the Q in quarantine. The yellow jack actually then became the flag from the letter L, this one here. So the letter L, when you see that on a ship, it indicates a warning, it indicates danger, and it means stop instantly. That's the background to the yellow jack, the flag. So what about quarantine in Albany? Albany is a maritime city, town, it always has been. So the dangers of importing disease by ship was always there, especially in the early days of European settlement, when medicines were rudimentary, antibiotics were not even thought of. So disease could travel, and that was the last thing that land-based towns and cities wanted, was the introduction of exotic diseases from other parts of the world. The first evidence of disease in an Albany ship came in 1869. Now, what were some of these diseases that could be introduced by visitors by ship? Well, these included a huge long list, and all of them appeared in Australian ports at one time or another. Diseases like diphtheria, typhoid, scarlet fever, yellow fever, whooping cough and measles, chicken pox and smallpox, cholera, and influenza. All of these highly contagious and could really rip through a community which didn't have immunity at the drop of a hat. Most in danger and at risk were indigenous populations who had never encountered any of these European-based diseases. So, of course, authorities were keen to keep out any chance of these diseases arriving in their towns. The first recorded ship coming to Albany carrying disease was the Sir William Molesworth in 1853. On board were 20 people carrying scarlet fever, sometimes known as scarlatina. And several people in the town contracted scarlet fever and died. This brought on a recommendation by the medical officer, Dr. Henry Wollaston, in Albany, for a government public health officer to be stationed in Albany. 2 years later, in 1855, 40 Chinese passengers from Singapore arrived on the Malacca, and they were ordered into quarantine. They were suffering from what was known as the itch. Now, I'm not sure what the itch is, but obviously it was a contagious disease of some sort. By 1860, things were getting more serious. The case of the Salsette. The Salsette, a ship, arrived, and the captains were required by law to report any disease on board. This, of course, they were reluctant to do because it would delay their onward voyage, and any passengers or freight that they needed to deliver would be then late in arrival. The captain of the Salsette failed to report this disease, and of course it was then taken on to subsequent ports around Australia. Albany got into trouble for not enforcing quarantine at that point in 1860. The disease got into the town. One European woman died, but every one of the population, of the indigenous population of Albany, which numbered 60, every one of those was infected. 29 died. That's almost 50% death rate of the indigenous population. There was more unrecorded events of scarlet fever in rural areas as well. Something had to be done, and quickly. New quarantine regulations were brought in. The coal ship, the Larkins, acted as a floating quarantine station. There was no land-based station at that stage. Passengers were put onto the Larkins while the ship was in port, and those who were ill were disembarked and isolated. But then the Larkins itself was put into quarantine when the daughter of the keeper of that coal hulk contracted scarlet fever. It was a hopeless situation and not sustainable. There was a move made to build a quarantine station, a permanent land-based quarantine station. The government resident at the time, a man named Alexander Cockburn Campbell, pushed for this. But the colonial secretary, Frederick Barley, who you can see here, he disregarded this request and said it was an unnecessary expense. The suggested location for this permanent quarantine station was actually outside the harbour, on an island which was connected to the mainland by a little sandbar. The island was called Mistaken Island, and this was the preferred place. The thinking at the time was that disease was carried by airborne winds and breezes. It's the theory of miasma, which has some credibility. So the idea was to put any quarantine station a long way from the centres of communities. Now, Frederick Barley features in the next part of this story of quarantine. He became a central character. It revolves around the ship Baroda. In 1869, the Baroda was on its way to Melbourne. There was a passenger on board who had apparently had smallpox, and the ship was not allowed to land. It was told to keep moving. Now, of course, this was not popular with the authorities in Melbourne, because when the ship arrived in Melbourne, it had an outbreak of smallpox on board. So they had to deal with this particular issue. The ship turned around and sailed back to Albany and parts further afield. On board the ship was Frederick Barley, the colonial secretary, returning to Perth, his home. Also on board was a prominent politician, Sir Luke Leake, whose brother, George Leake, later became Premier of WA. Luke Leake was the Speaker of the West Australian Parliament. They were both on board the Baroda. The ship arrived in Albany, and of course, it's not surprising that there was still infection on board. The medical officer in Albany, Dr. Rogers, insisted that the ship be put in quarantine. No one could land. The alternative for the passengers, if they didn't wish to stay in Western Australia, the alternative was to stay on the ship. Their next port of call was Ceylon, Sri Lanka. The passengers were not impressed, especially Frederick Barley and Luke Leake. They were told they had to go into quarantine, but there was no permanent quarantine station. They were put into tents on Mistaken Island for 21 days. In May in Albany, on a bleak, windswept beach, on an unvegetated island miles from town. They and their wives were not impressed. It got the message across to Mr. Barley that a quarantine station was needed. And why are we surprised that in the very next session of the West Australian Parliament, the Colonial Secretary himself recommended that money be set aside for a permanent quarantine station in Albany. What a coincidence. So money was set aside to build this station in the 1860s. But where were they to put it? Should they put it on Mistaken Island, that little patch outside the harbour, a long way from the town? Or should they put it inside the main harbour, again on the other side of the harbour from the town, but at least closer to hand? The government and the town favoured the Mistaken Island option. You can see on this aerial photo, Mistaken Island, on the bottom right of your picture, a little island almost connected to the Vancouver Peninsula. The shipping companies, on the other hand, led by Captain Toll, who was the head of the P&O depot in Albany, said, no, that's too far away and too difficult for ships. If they come into the harbour, how are they going to discharge passengers who may be suffering from disease? We need to put this quarantine station inside the harbour. The shipping companies, after much debate prevailed, and the quarantine station was planned and built on the tip of the Vancouver Peninsula. You can see that right in the centre of your picture, with the town to the north of that. It's interesting that emotions ran high in the newspapers as to the siting of this new quarantine station. Have a look at this picture of the Princess Royal Harbour in Albany from the 1880s. The eventual site of the quarantine station was directly to the top right of your picture, that little mound coming out into the harbour from there. But then some of the words that were published in the Perth papers in the 1870s about this station were certainly strong, especially against Frederick Barley, the Colonial Secretary. Let me read it. There is a very strong feeling of irritation here against the Colonial Secretary on account of his determination to have a quarantine station in the inner harbour. The feeling is shared by all classes and will not end here. It went on to say, would it not be possible to promote the unlucky officer on account of his long services? The government of Baroda, a mythical country, is, I believe, vacant, and the mission to the Pongos Islands, at any rate, let him go from here while the play is good. They were very keen to get rid of Frederick Barley at any cost. The quarantine station went ahead, but it was quite a primitive and a small construction initially. Only 2 small cottages were built. They were very primitive. They put a caretaker there. He had little to do and certainly was not paid much. He was allowed to keep the rabbits that he captured. That was one of his perks. Added to his duties were he was to keep an eye on the powder magazine. And this little magazine, this building, was built out on the spit of land, which was just off the quarantine station. You see, as well as putting people suffering from disease a long way from town, you also put the armaments that were going to defend the town a long way away. Because that, if that blew up, could have just as bad an effect on the town's community as disease. So this little powder station, as it was called, was built on what was then an island, Geek Island, just off the tip of the peninsula where the quarantine station was built. It is still there. But it's no longer on an island, it's been joined to the mainland. Life went on in quarantine. This little quarantine station, known as the Albany Quarantine Station, it had no particular name at that point, went on, but it was overwhelmed in the 1880s and 1890s because as shipping increased and migration increased, so did the cases of disease, even though public health measures had improved to that time. In the 1890s, the Orizaba, a ship coming in, had 68 passengers who were due to serve out a term of quarantine. But the station could accommodate only 20, so the others had to live in tents. This was not satisfactory. Dr. Ingleby, who was the town doctor at the time, ordered that they be cleared for landing subject to fumigation. They had to be fumigated. So a much bigger station was planned and funded by the government, still the state government, on the same site as that original little station. Now, as well as agreeing to extend the station, there was hope that the station would become a federal or a national responsibility. And after Federation, that was the case. But still back in the 1880s and 1890s, there was huge pressure on this quarantine station. The Elderslie, for example, came in 1887 with almost 200 passengers who needed quarantine. And this really put huge pressure on the facilities. There was a thought and certainly evidence of racism and discrimination even in the quarantine days back then against Asiatics. There was allegations of profiteering by the caretakers at the cost of detainees who had no choice but to stay there. There were complaints of bad conditions, of a lack of water, of a lack of bathrooms, lighting, and also, believe it or not, a lack of class segregation. First-class passengers actually wanted first-class quarantine accommodation. They wouldn't get it there. In 1896, large extensions were designed and proposed: first-class accommodation and a dining room, new third-class accommodation, doctors and servant rooms, kitchen additions, numerous stores, laundry and wash house, a disinfecting house with adjoining bathrooms, and luggage stores to be built adjacent to that powder magazine. An isolation hospital, a separate hospital with a separate jetty and underground tanks. The designs for these improvements were approved by the colonial architect George Temple Poole, a very influential figure in West Australian architecture and design. But it seems likely that a lot of the actual design work was done by this man, John Granger, who was also a notable colonial architect who specialised in bridge design. You might be familiar with the Princess Street Bridge in Melbourne, the end of Swanston Street leading onto St Kilda Road. That's a John Granger design. But John Granger is also notable for being the father of one of Australia's best known classical composers, Percy Grainger. So he has an influence in Albany. These facilities were completed. The new designs included a superheater which was used to fumigate passengers' luggage. At least 2 of the new huts were designed for Asians in keeping with that White Australia policy at the time, which was prominent in Western Australia and then, of course, nationally after Federation. The facilities were large, and the caretaker, one of the first caretakers, was a man named Paul Boditz. And many of these photos that you're looking at now come from him and his time as caretaker at the quarantine station. The station was used during wartime as well, during the Boer War, to combat measles and pneumonia from returning troops, and of course also after the First World War. the well-known and much publicised pandemic of the Spanish flu, which killed possibly 50 million people worldwide. Also touched Albany. Very briefly, we were quite worried about the influence of the Spanish flu on returning soldiers from Europe from the Great War. Luckily, there were no cases in Albany, but certainly ships were very carefully watched and fumigated when they came through on their way to Sydney and Melbourne. The only two burials at the quarantine station, there's a small graveyard there, occurred during that period after World War I. And both have a couple of mysteries. One was a Private Roy Maguire. He was a 19-year-old Queenslander returning from the war. Died of cerebrospinal meningitis. And the other one was Joseph Grant, a seaman, not a military man, who apparently died of pneumonic influenza. Both were treated in the hospital at the Albany quarantine station. Town doctors also doubled as quarantine officers, and they would go out and greet boats arriving. The captains, as I mentioned earlier, had an obligation to report any sickness on board, and anyone who was sick would be taken off separately before reaching port to a small jetty at the quarantine station, and from there assessed and either put into isolation or taken to the hospital. They did not enter the town at all. The quarantine station was last used in 1928, when the ship the Vedic was quarantined for measles. So, what's happened to the quarantine station since that time? It's almost 100 years now. It's still part of Albany's vista. It still exists, and it's been used as many things over the intervening years. Town access to the quarantine station was always somewhat controversial. It was, remember, a federal institution, and the Commonwealth of Australia had control over it, but the town saw it, as it wasn't being used, as they should actually be able to have access to it. And there was some controversy in 1933 when the Albany Yacht Club, the Princess Royal Sailing Club, was denied access to the grounds for a picnic. It generated quite a lot of local heat. In 1942, the buildings there were used by American naval personnel. Submarines were relocated from Fremantle to Albany for a period of about 6 or 7 months in the depths of war in 1942. And those buildings were used to house many of those US sailors. The station was officially closed in 1956. It had remained open and available as a quarantine station, even though it had no cases to treat. But it was officially closed in 1956 and then used as a holiday destination and a camp. Some of these photos date from that time. And this is about the first time that we find the use of its common name today, Quarrenup. Now, for many years, I and many other people thought that Quarrenup was a made-up name referencing the quarantine station. Now, in the Noongar language of the southwest of Western Australia, the suffix up means place of. So it's a logical conclusion to think that Quarrenup might be the place of quarantine, a made-up European adaptation. But no, I was wrong. The Quor is actually the Noongar name, the Aboriginal name, for the brush-tailed wallaby, which at one point inhabited that peninsula. So it's technically Quarrenup, not Quarrenup, but it's been used as Quarrenup, Q-U-A-R-A-N-U-P, ever since about the late 1950s. The caretaker, Ted Wheeler, and his wife set up the camp as a private camp for school children and visits. And there were many stories of camps from schools coming from all over the state to spend time at Quarrenup, and many ghostly tales about the morgue in the hospital and dares between students who were dared to stay overnight in the morgue and sleep on the slab in the morgue, which is still there today. It's still used as a community camp as part of the Department of Sport and Recreation in Western Australia. So the buildings have been updated and adapted and rejuvenated as a camp for school children and young people all over the countryside. And the Quarren-up music camps are famous in Albany. Summer music camps for musicians, young musicians from all over the state. These have been running for at least the last 40 years. So the story of quarantine, the yellow jack, the flying of that yellow flag to indicate disease and danger on board, has a long history in Albany going way back to the 1850s. Now, luckily, not many arrivals come by ship these days. Anybody suffering disease is checked at airports and quarantined accordingly, if appropriate. We don't have a use for the quarantine station in Albany, but it remains there, as does the little powder magazine, which for so many years stored the town's armaments and supplies of gunpowder. It never blew up, and the quarantine station served its purpose to keep Albany healthy over all those years. I hope you've enjoyed this tale of quarantine in Albany. From where I'm speaking, it's a very pertinent topic. And we can think in the past, quarantine has been very important to the health and welfare of all of our communities. Thanks so much for listening.